So, the Grand Theft Auto series has been around for a long time. Almost 30 years, actually, and in those near 3 decades, it, like the larger culture around it, has evolved its depictions of queer people. From callous and completely insensitive stereotypes, to genuine attempts at progressive representation, at least for the time. Grand Theft Auto has always been, in a way, a microcosm of American culture, and as somebody who only accepted that they were queer last year, I thought, what better time to examine our culture's view of LGBTQIA+ individuals through the lens of Grand Theft Auto. I'll rate each representation on a scale of good, neutral, or bad as I see it. To my non-queer viewers, please just try to keep an open mind. I am not canceling Grand Theft Auto. Such a thing doesn't even seem possible, nor do I want to do it. I do love this franchise, and it has lots of things that I would and will defend. It also has things that I strongly dislike, however, but I believe you can and should criticize the art that you enjoy and still enjoy it. My own perspective on the series has evolved as I have. To my queer audience specifically, I can only ever speak from my own perspective as a trans woman. Please correct me in the comments as much as you'd like to if you speak to any other particular representation. Also, while it wasn't the original spark for the idea, the LGBTQ video game archive was an invaluable resource while researching this video. Check out their website, they have a comprehensive look at queer representation across video games, and it's super fascinating. If there's anything that I miss in this video that you noticed, please let me know in the comments below. Also, this video is very likely to be demonetized for even mentioning LGBTQ issues. It's not a guarantee, but I know from other queer creators that I watch that this is a real possibility, so consider signing up to my Patreon at patreon.com/thecriminalhistorian if you like what I do. There will be a full ad for the Patreon in the middle of the video too, so you have been warned. Without further ado, let's get into it. Starting off in the original Grand Theft Auto, the only real reference to anything queer comes in the form of a character, El Burro. Now, El Burro will send the player messages, and in his only cutscene it is pretty heavily implied that he has a sexual relationship with the player to reward them for their services. Since in GTA 1 you can technically play as a female protagonist, some people have interpreted this to mean that El Burro must be bi, but lines like, "Hey there pretty boy, I'm missing you, Burro," as well as other messages received on the pager throughout GTA 1 imply to me that the canonical protagonist of the game is meant to be male. Moreover, El Burro's physical appearance, mannerisms, and messages are all pretty heavily coded as stereotypically gay, and from my perspective, he isn't exactly a shining example of a positive representation, given that he perpetuated ideas common around that time that gay men were all just deviants. Hell, even I made a joke in a recent video about El Burro's uncomfortable conversation with the player, but to be fair, what actually scared me about him was that mustache. He also technically again appears in GTA 3 and even in Chinatown Wars, but those iterations of the character seem to have dropped any explicit references to him being gay, so we can't really count those. Moving on to GTA 2, the only real thing that I could find was the character Tetsuo. Tetsuo is described as a homosexual Japanese man, but nothing I could find seemed to indicate that it was otherwise an important or relevant part of his character. I still haven't actually gotten to Tetsuo in GTA 2 on my own, and am therefore going off of what I can find, but as far as I can tell, the fact that he is gay is completely incidental and is never used either positively or negatively to characterize the man. He is a torturer for the Yakuza with a long rap sheet, but the details of his personal life never actually come up. Moving on to the GTA London packs, once again the only very small reference to anything queer that I could find is apparently a character named Pretty Charlie. Now, I think the only reason that people think this is because at one point, Charlie calls the protagonist gorgeous, and since all the protags of GTA London are canonically male, this must mean he's gay. That seems to be it though, but just like Tetsuo in GTA 2, I haven't actually gotten to this point yet myself, and only very recently even started tackling the London packs, so perhaps there is more to this one, but I doubt it. As it stands, it's pretty neutral. Charlie just thinks the protag is cute. Finally though, we reach the 3D era games, where my knowledge of the series truly begins, and GTA 3 does have a few more explicit references to queer things. For starters, we have Asuka and Maria. Now, Maria is explicitly into Claude, but it's also pretty heavily implied that her and Asuka are also having a sexual relationship of some kind. So Maria is our first bisexual representation, and Asuka is possibly another, or the first lesbian in Grand Theft Auto, though she never makes it completely clear what her preferences are. It's arguable that she hits on Claude, but I never really interpreted it that way. Considering these facts about the two women are never actually played for laughs, at least you're not meant to laugh at them, I think this one isn't one of the worst representations for the time. Unsurprisingly though, it leans heavily into the fetishization aspect of it. Lesbian's good cause girl on girl, gay's bad because men need to be manly. Overall, I guess I'll go with neutral. Then we have the pedestrians walking the streets of Liberty City who are clearly coded as gay stereotypes of the time. I mean, they quote lines from the Village People. So again, not a great depiction, but perhaps comparatively harmless in the long run. I mean, who doesn't love that song? There are also a number of gay slurs in this and most of the games, with some of the businesses or slogans, but this again speaks to the overall conception of queerness to the general public at the time. It's mostly just gay guys, occasionally a lesbian, but that's about as complex as it gets. And the final reference in GTA 3 that I could think of, I think speaks more to the actual intent at the time, Laszlo. During Laszlo's conversation with Maria, she implies that he's gay at the end, and there are numerous instances of this coming up about Laszlo throughout the franchise, which all have a similar connotation. Laszlo might be gay, and that's funny because man not supposed to sleep with man. Later depictions would lean Laszlo more into the bisexual category, if anything, but he was certainly never a positive representation. I mean, he's Laszlo. Again, GTA is, in a way, a microcosm of the culture at the time, and I would liken a lot of GTA's early depictions of anything queer as at the level of a 12-year-old straight boy who just discovered the internet. Not good, but I mean, they're a kid, and we're all stupid kids at one point or another, and to clarify, it's likely that a lot of these interpretations, subconsciously or otherwise, were a part of my own early conceptions of queerness. As somebody who only accepted they were queer in their late 20s, I don't have the experience of growing up knowing and hearing these portrayals. I know for a fact that I held some pretty toxic beliefs when I was much younger, but the mark of a good person, I think, is intent. I am not sitting in judgment if you yourself have laughed at any of the depictions in this video. There is no correct way to feel about the media that you consume. Something that was raised in a community post that I made before making this video is just because you're queer doesn't mean you are actively involved in the community, and not being involved doesn't make your opinion any more or less valid. A lot of my own opinions and perspectives have changed dramatically over the last 4 months or so, but really, over my entire life. I have just been hyper aware of it lately. I may find plenty of the representations of queer characters in Grand Theft Auto personally offensive now, but I am not sitting here in boycott of the franchise. You can both enjoy something and recognize flaws in it. I have a particularly weird perspective now, since I spent a large chunk of my life believing that I was cisgendered and straight, but in discovering who I really was, I now see a new side to things that I never could before. If you're queer, I hope you will let me know what your own experience has been with the GTA series. No wrong answers. Maybe you never cared about the representation, maybe you found it all completely acceptable, maybe you think it's all completely problematic, but I just genuinely want to hear from you because I really am curious. I really think the GTA franchise is perhaps one of the best encapsulations of the general zeitgeist for when each game was released. Like the world around it, Grand Theft Auto has undoubtedly changed its depictions of queer people to be more positive and neutral. I don't want to cancel Grand Theft Auto or any such nonsense. I'm actually especially hopeful that the next GTA will continue the trend that we've already seen, and I think that's already been proven. We're getting our first female protagonist, and I, for one, couldn't be happier. I think the people concerned about GTA becoming woke should probably look at the series' history because, like the wider culture, the overall impression of queer people in GTA, while not always, or even usually positive, was certainly not overwhelmingly negative or hateful. Ignorant at its worst, and I don't know about you, but I have been plenty ignorant many times in my life. Intent matters, and what I see from Grand Theft Auto as a whole, like I see from most of wider society as a whole, is gradual and increased acceptance. I wish it were faster, sure, and there are still losses, but I'm happy with the way it's going, and if I can make any tiny difference in pushing it in that direction, I'm going to. Oh, and for the longtime fans of the channel, even though I've only been going through this consciously and in earnest for a few months, for the entire duration of the channel's existence, I have been quite progressive. That is to say, I am not going to stop making any of the kinds of videos that people have come to enjoy from me and that I enjoy making, but like any person, I am growing, and like any artist, my opinions inform my work. So this isn't the start of me making all of my videos about queerness and GTA, but I do have new perspectives, so I might make videos like that occasionally, but only when I feel like I actually have something to talk about. Things like a criminal history and future episodes of GTA biographies are still very much on the table, and I don't plan to ever stop the Game Vault. If you have enjoyed my channel thus far, but you are apprehensive about this seeming shift, I ask that you stick around. I am still me, and I aim to continue entertaining people as best as I can. I hope you'll continue to be one of them. Vice City, taking place in the 80s, had plenty of gender ambiguity and sexual freedom. It also had plenty of insensitivity, as we'll see. The first thing that comes to mind, though, is a bit ambiguous. I mean, it's ambiguous as to exactly what the intention was. During some of the missions for the band Love Fist, which I'll get to them, there's a psycho stalker that tries to kill the band. Now, when you first encounter this person, they present as either a cross-dressing cis man or a transgender woman with a deep voice, but the more likely interpretation, I think, is a less charitable version of the latter. The thing is, this aspect to their character is absolutely never explored in dialogue. Because of this, it seems more likely that them being trans, if that was the intention, was also intended to be a dog whistle that this person is crazy and deviant. I mean, they are called the Psycho. I suppose if I wanted to be as charitable as possible, it isn't necessarily a negative depiction since their identity never explicitly comes up, but this was 2002, and I am 99.9 repeating % sure that that was not the intent. But backing up to the band they were actually stalking, Love Fist. Now, Love Fist are a parody of glam metal bands in the 80s in general, and, well, there was a lot of gender ambiguity going on in the 80s glam scene. The lead singer, Jez Torrent, sings about cross-dressing in their song Dangerous Bastard, and in one of Tommy's missions with the band, he says they're all bisexual and nobody argues otherwise. So who knows if Jez actually likes to cross-dress or not, or if any of the band are actually bisexual, But either way, I don't think this is really all that bad of a depiction. I mean, it isn't nuanced, and it's goofy as all hell. It also isn't meant to make the band look good, it's meant to be a joke about glam rock, but for me personally, this doesn't really bother me. It's a fairly true-to-life parody with that rock star sense of humor, and given the year, whatever. But I have to remember that nostalgia can blind me in a lot of ways. Do you interpret art and judge it based on the acceptable standards of the time the art was made? Or the standards of the time when the interpretation is made? Well, I think it depends. We all have a line. The older something gets, the easier it seems to be honest about its intentions, about what it might have said about the culture around it. Vice City is now 22 years old. Oh god, I'm old. And with Vice City 2, so to speak, on the horizon in GTA 6, I think I can be honest about the intentions around depictions like Love Fist, while simultaneously not being bothered by it personally. The idea of Jez being a crossdresser is fine, but it's meant as a mean-spirited joke. Nobody could take someone who crossdresses seriously, obviously. The idea of the band being bisexual is a joke in the same vein. Look at these nutty rockers, they're just so confused about everything, even the kind of people they're supposed to be attracted to. I don't think these were the conscious intentions behind these jokes, necessarily. The person writing these characters probably didn't sit down and write them thinking about any of these kinds of things, but the result is the same. Is it possible the mean-spirited but not overall negative depictions did more harm or more good from simply making people aware that things like crossdressers and bisexuals exist? I don't know. I don't think anyone can ever say, but when I watch and listen to these characters now, I don't think about any of this. I just laugh at how goofy they are. I couldn't really think of any other explicit references in Vice City though. There are some in Vice City stories, but we aren't quite there yet. So for now, let's move on to San Andreas, because there's plenty. In San Andreas, the dateable woman in San Fierro, Katie, is pretty homophobic, based on her in-game dialogue. This really sucks for me because Katie also, arguably, has one of the best benefits when dating her, allowing you to keep your weapons at the hospital upon death. In the new definitive editions, though, it's a lot less likely that you'll lose all your weapons if you die, thanks to the mission replay system, but still, definitely a bummer. There's also the television show My Five Uncles, which is a parody of the 90s show My Two Dads. This one is pretty harmless and maybe funny. 5 men who are obviously coded to be gay all live together and adopt a teenage daughter, hijinks ensue. San Andreas also introduced the sport, Ultimate Disc in the Dark, which is basically Ultimate Frisbee in the dark and with a lot of gay undertones and overtones. This game actually continues to be referenced as late as GTA 4, with the wonderful Bernie Crane, who we'll get to later, being an avid player. We also have the Queens District in San Fierro, a parody of real-world San Francisco's Castro District. This place is lined with rainbow banners, and like the real-world Castro, especially in the early 90s, is very much advertised as the city's gay district. If you live in modern-day Castro, I would love to hear what the neighborhoods look like today. Has it retained a distinctly gay vibe? Has it evolved into a more generally queer and LGBTQ-friendly area? Has it lost all of that completely? I'd love to know. Then we come to the first of the 2 San Andreas references to my own area of familiarity. The most commonly used vehicle customization shop in the game is Transfender, with an obvious and definitively very dated allusion to a harmful trans stereotype. Now, this one doesn't particularly bother me a ton. It's a dumb and ignorant joke, but it isn't too in your face. The second trans reference I heard in San Andreas actually came during my most recent playthrough. I can't remember what radio station it played on specifically, but it was an ad for a new gender swap kit with more of those harmful stereotypes. This one bugged me a lot more than the Transfender shop. It's one of those things that I never really noticed or cared about before, but now it just really makes me cringe. In San Fierro, the cops all have dialogue lines that are obviously intended to make them sound gay in an unflattering light. They say a lot of, shall we say, provocative things to the player. There's also the owner of all the Prolapse clothing stores, who is pretty obviously coded to be gay in that Andy Dick kind of way. And finally, we have the mission OG Loke. Now, I already said quite a bit about this mission in my San Andreas Game Vault episode, and when I wrote that, I didn't even know that I was queer. Even then, I condemned the mission as being harmful and perpetuating dangerous stereotypes, but what I find super disturbing is the number of people who go to bat for this mission. Almost weekly, I still get somebody leaving a comment to the effect of, "Oh, it was actually a consensual relationship between Loke and Freddy in prison, it's perfectly fine." And look, is it technically possible for two gay men in prison to have a consensual relationship? Sure, but please do not be so dense as to assume that was the intention behind this mission at all. And even if we are super charitable and assume that in prison Loke and Freddy had a 100% consensual relationship, the game is still making fun of them for being gay. So, we either have a prison rape joke, a gay joke, or a combination of the two. No matter how you look at it though, it ain't good. If you feel the urge to try and defend this mission to me again, understand there is nothing you're going to say to me that's going to make me think it's okay. But also understand that I am still playing the game. You can both recognize problems with art you consume and still consume it. That is, I hope, the last I ever have to talk about this mission, but then again, I am currently playing through the definitive edition for the first time, so I guess it probably won't be, but not looking forward to it. Now on to Liberty City stories, and there aren't a ton of references to queer things in this game, none that I can think of off the top of my head anyway, but the wonderful LGBTQ game archive gave me a few. For one, there's the rival software companies meant to stand in for Apple and Microsoft, that being the Fruit OS and the TOS operating system. Respective fans of each OS are called Tossers and Fruits, which are outdated and derogatory terms for gay men. This, as you may have noticed, is the most common kind of queer reference in GTA games. Gay men exist, and they like to have sex in a way that's different. How amusing! But like, articulated by a 13-year-old, or like, Ralph from The Simpsons? There's the organization mentioned on the radio, Citizens United Negating Technology for Life, and People's Safety, or Cunt Flaps, classy, which isn't in and of itself a queer reference, but in that game, one of their goals is to ban a website they accuse of influencing visitors to become homosexuals. Now, this could therefore be taken as a positive representation, so to speak. The organization is meant to parody real-world news outlets and TV stations who accused Rockstar and the wider video game industry of corrupting the youth. Citizens United is never portrayed as something to be sympathetic with, but made fun of. So if one of their goals is to take down some websites they don't like because they're homophobes, Rockstar poking fun at them can be taken as them saying people who would do something like that are ridiculous. A bit of a stretch? Perhaps, but I think it makes sense. I'm gonna count this one as positive. Not so positive, though, is Kazuki Kasen, the brother to Asuka and Kenji from GTA 3, who is pretty obviously coded as being gay. Now, one could also technically see him as being bi, since he is married to a woman, Toshiko Kasen, who incidentally has him killed, but the path that leads to that outcome makes it pretty clear Kazuki is meant to be a closeted gay man. You even have to kill him in a suggestive sword fight. On to Vice City Stories, which has two minor references and one very big one, so let's start with the small stuff. There's a bar, the White Stallions Bar, which is a homosexual white supremacist bar that you see during a mission with Lance. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the intention behind this joke was, but the way I read it is the writer thinking that somebody being gay is simply a trait worth laughing at. So we have a bunch of Nazis, and everybody hates Nazis, but guess what? They're also gay! Isn't that even worse? Now, there are technically gay people out there who are also white supremacists, I'm sure, I would love to believe that the answer is no, but I have to imagine, just by statistics alone, that they exist. Now, are there enough of them concentrated in the entire world to have a whole bar around that idea? I don't know, but I somehow doubt it. Then, much more in line with a GTA-style queer reference, we also have the Lay's Beans Cafe. Get it? Lay's Beans? Lesbians? Ha 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 ha. This one is harmless, it's a dad joke, whatever. But now we have to talk about Rennie Wasselmeyer. Now, Rennie is a character who technically appeared in Liberty City Stories before this, but as a DJ, and that game actually takes place after this one, more than 10 years actually. In this game, Rennie is a rather harmful and very mid-2000s understanding of a trans person. Rennie has had multiple sex change operations and changes their physical appearance from man to woman back and forth on the regular. This is facilitated by their role as a successful film producer with the money to afford so many surgeries. Now, when I did a poll before making this video, I had at least one person seem to be completely unbothered by Rennie, and honestly, I myself am not even that bothered by them. The thing that I suppose bothers me a little is the idea that Rennie was some people's conception of all trans people, since I bet for plenty of people, this was their first exposure to a person outside the gender norm. I know there's a decent possibility that Rennie was the first trans person I ever saw. Now once again, could somebody like Rennie exist? Sure, and their identity would be as valid as any, but the thing is, Rennie was very clearly not written by a trans person or meant to be a positive representation of them. So, I'm left a little bit conflicted. I overall enjoy Rennie because they're simply entertaining, and as a trans woman myself, I'm not really bothered by them, especially since this was 2007, and Rockstar would never get away with doing something like this, nor do I think they would try. It was what it was. If I had been who I am now, back then, sure, it would have bothered me a lot more, but now, I'm pretty much fine with it. We were all dumb kids once, and I kinda love Rennie.
Darlings, I love you both. Vic, can you drive me to the airport on your way to the gig?
Sure. Come on.
This video and all videos on my channel are brought to you in large part by the wonderful support of my patrons on patreon.com. An extra special thank you to my executive producer tier patrons, Ezra Hambrick, Mason Collin, Chuck K45, and King GTA 15, as well as my Walker Villain tier patron, Michael Vandenberg. Patrons at these tiers also have the option to promote a little bit of their own content, so this video is brought to you by Ezra's Let's Play channel, Scott Games 99, Mason Collins' podcast channel, We're About Everything, and Chuck K45's Upstart Farming channel. I release all videos a little early to patrons, and completely uncensored. I give you any of the original music tracks I've created for a given video, and for extra generous supporters, you can even reserve a slot for your favorite game in my ongoing series, The Game Vault. You'll also get to see your name in the credits of all videos that are produced while you're pledged, get access to a small patron-only Discord where you can easily speak with me or see little behind-the-scenes snippets, and you'll receive my eternal gratitude. Seriously, especially these days, those of you who support my work directly are absolutely incredible, and I can't properly express how grateful I am to you all. Thank you so much. Patreon.com/thecriminalhistorian. Alright, on to GTA 4, and this is definitely where we started to see a slow but noticeable change in queer portrayals going forward. Well, we'll notice it a lot more by the time we reach GTA 4's second DLC, but still, in 2008 we do have a lot of that classic Rockstar queer humor, and the first textbook example is somebody they've used as recently as 2019, Brucey Kibbutz. Now, back in 2008, Brucey was pretty much just two jokes, steroid junkie and closeted gay man. Throughout GTA 4, Brucey constantly makes sure to let everybody in the room know that he is not attracted to men, and several of his missions revolve around other gay men, heavily implying that Brucey has a secret side life that he is so desperate to keep secret that he's willing to kill to do it. Or at least have people killed, since he's also far too afraid to ever do it himself. In The Ballad of Gay Tony, Brucey even tries to kiss another man, seemingly confirming that he's gay, though he could also just as easily be bi. By the time we saw Brucey again in the Diamond Casino update for GTA Online, though, they had all but dropped the closeted gay jokes, which both makes sense in terms of the actual cultural context and the context of Brucey moving to the much more stereotypically progressive state of California, San Andreas, and even more so LA, LS. One of the missions Brucey sends you on sees you killing a man with the handle French Tom, who you meet on the in-game website lovemeet.net. There are several other people on Lovemeet though, some of which the player could actually date. There's a man with the handle Oscar Wilde, whose profile picture alludes to the same sort of joke as we saw with Brucey, that of a clearly closeted gay man, his name being an obvious reference to the famous Irish writer who was imprisoned for being gay. There's No Big Willie, who just kinda has a relatively normal, if still satirical profile as an openly gay man. We have the relatively and unintentionally based Matt Black, who would probably identify as non-binary to some extent if I had to guess, since this was 15 years ago in universe. There's also Misunderstood, who labels herself as flexible in terms of her sexuality, indicating that maybe she's bi or pan. She seems to generally have an interest in men, but like she said, she's flexible, and perhaps this is a person who 15 years later might be more comfortable openly identifying as something like bi, but who knows. We also have Jenny Fun, who might be one of the only asexual representations in the entire series. She says she prefers cuddling, and though she indicates she would prefer a relationship with a man, she's overall a pretty normal-looking asexual person, and that's how I choose to interpret it. I find this profile particularly funny because clearly they were trying to make a joke here back in 2008, but now, in the modern era, I have unironically met this kind of person many times, and they're usually very chill and down to earth. Finally, we have Sobo Ho, who is one of the few characters the player can actually date. Her real name is Carmen Ortiz. Now, Carmen is actually given a lot of characterization. She's probably bi, if I had to put a label on it, but her own profile indicates that she is a free spirit, so maybe pan would be a bit more accurate. She's clearly more attracted to men, or male-presenting people, but dances pretty close to Miss Elizabeta Torres on one occasion. She's also in several open relationships with other men besides Nico, and deals with a lot of self-image issues and self-consciousness in general. She seems to be simultaneously full of herself and also hate herself. I have met plenty of Carmens in my life, so I definitely sympathize. She's an interesting one. I'd say the way she's overall portrayed is rather negative though. Almost all of the things that I find sympathetic about her are things that the game tries to use as reasons to discount her as trouble, and to be fair, she kind of is. It's hard to say exactly what the intention was behind Carmen, but what I like about her is that she's nuanced, so I'm gonna give this one a light thumbs up. Elizabeta Torres is also herself pretty evidently coded to either be bisexual or a lesbian. She most definitely dances with Carmen, as I mentioned, but Johnny and Malk also bring up the possibility of her having a relationship with a woman named Marta in a mission. Now that I think about it, I don't remember if Elizabeta ever explicitly comes on to any male characters, so she might indeed be another lesbian representation. Nice. And just a side note, because I'm playing through the game again right now, I fucking love Elizabeta.
I fed him his balls!
Next, we have probably the most well-known queer representation in the entire GTA franchise, after Gay Tony himself, and that's Bernie Crane, the man that Nico initially believes he is looking for in Liberty City. There's also, technically, the man who leads Nico to Bernie, another implied gay man, Talbot Daniels, but he isn't very important. Bernie himself is also a gay man and living in GTA's New York City in 2008. He also deals with plenty of homophobes, including an actual stalker who tries to kill him and is himself killed by Nico. Bernie likes to play Ultimate Disc in the Dark, like I said before, is incredibly flamboyant, and doesn't hide the fact that he's gay whatsoever. He is, if you will, Gay Tony before Gay Tony was Gay Tony. Sort of, but we'll get to Mr. Prince later. There's also the man that Bernie is dating throughout GTA 4, the deputy mayor of Liberty City, Bryce Dawkins. Dawkins doesn't seem to be based on any specific person, but is a parody of the old trope of a vehemently anti-gay right-wing politician secretly being gay themselves. Dawkins is never actually seen or heard in-game, but events surrounding him are mentioned in multiple missions in both the base game and the game's 2 DLCs. The man who works at Perseus in Liberty City, much like the guy who worked at Prolapse in GTA San Andreas, is also heavily coded as gay, in a very similar manner too. Very Andy Dick, super flamboyant, one of the 2 ways Rockstar knew how to portray a gay man. Also, apparently the guy's name is Marcus. Who knew? There's a serial killer in GTA 4 named Eddie Lowe who is implied to be bisexual, but I'm not going to get into the details about him here. Suffice it to say, at least for this particular examination, he ain't exactly a good representation and is likely based on real-world serial killers who themselves help to marginalize and stereotype queer people. People who you definitely already know, but whose names and faces I won't show here. Let's move on. There are also plenty of pedestrians in GTA 4 who are pretty obviously coded as gay, once again, exclusively gay men though it seems. They aren't as plentiful as they were in San Fierro, but are still here and there and more common in certain neighborhoods. There are also a couple minor characters either mentioned or seen in the LCPD criminal database who are implied to be gay or bi. There's also at least one character who is banned from Tony's club along with their male partner, who is still described, if you look them up today, using an outdated and offensive term for trans people. Since this was 2008, it's unclear what this person would actually be, but it's pretty clear the intention was, well, not great. Marcel Lemure is another extremely flamboyant gay man who is the co-host of the show Fizz on WKTT. Jeremy St. Ives is also coded as being gay, with him being the other kind of gay man that GTA always defaults to, the closeted one. He's the host of a show called The Men's Room, for crying out loud. They aren't very subtle about it, but, you know, it's GTA. Rick Bastian is also a parody host of your favorite hateful right-wing radio hosts circa 2008. He is all manner of phobes and cysts wrapped into one neat little package. Then there's maybe Lisa Lynn, a co-host on the Martin Sirius show, GTA's version of Howard Stern. Lisa is, if we take Martin at his very uncouth word, a trans woman of color. Now, that is not how Martin describes her. He uses a very different word, shall we say, but it isn't actually clear to me if she's actually meant to be trans, or if it's just a veiled insult meant to say that Lisa isn't attractive enough. Honestly, I lean towards the latter. She's also played by a woman of color, Carla Renata, who as far as I can tell is herself cis. Also on the Martin Sirius show is a stereotypical depiction of lesbians as something for straight men to jerk off to when he brings 2 girls on air to make out in the booth for listeners. Once again, Martin Sirius is meant to be a Howard Stern, so I take the collective show as a condemnation of the actual radio personality who has also been accused of being racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, etc. Therefore, the whole show could be taken positively, but that depends on you, I guess. Now, I started writing this script a while ago, before I started a new playthrough of GTA 4 for the Game Vault that I'm working on, and well, during this most recent playthrough, I've been noticing tons of other little things here and there that I didn't before. One of them, though, which I was amazed I hadn't seen mentioned on the article that I used as a basis for this script at the LGBTQ Video Game Archive, is Bluesy St. John. Bluesy is one of the acts at the Russian Perestroika Club in Hove Beach, and they sing about, well, being trans. The whole joke with Bluesy is that they are very traditionally feminine presenting and sing in a typically seductive kind of way, all the while singing about how they want to transition to a man. The host even begs them at the end of their act to not get a sex change since they are already so sexy. This joke is restated in an ad for the club on the radio. Then there's a bunch of smaller references like with the post-op vans, an obvious allusion to trans women, the Republican Space Rangers, a bunch of closeted gay men going around spewing anti-gay right-wing rhetoric while cleansing the galaxy with parental rights banners, I presume. There's an ad for the TV show Medicate Me, which explicitly references a lesbian with a woman who says I'm gay, but there's an, I think, unintended implication from the line that precedes it, telling the woman she's pregnant, her gayness being the punchline.
You won't believe what happens this season on Medicate Me. What starts out as a simple kid getting a splinter escalates into a full-scale terrorist attack on the city. Luckily, the doctors of St. Judas General Hospital are ready.
Bob, you're drunk, and we've got to save some kids' lives.
That's because I love you, Karen.
That's original. I'm never going to win an Emmy if you don't start writing better scripts.
In the next episode, a patient wakes up and discovers he's a polygamist. Oh, and Karen, I've got some serious news. You are 8 months pregnant.
But I'm gay.
Exactly.
Medicate Me. Hospitals get real.
There's a TMZ-style parody website in-game called OurOwnRealities.com, which has a number of references to queer things, mostly just speculation that a celebrity might be gay, like the real TMZ in 2008. There's the Vindication Angel Cursebuster BC TM that advertises, among other things, the ability to prevent kiddies from seeing homosexual content, an obvious hit at right-wing reactionaries. Oh yeah, there's also that time when Agent ULP says that everybody in the FBI, FIB, is gay, which I think was an actual stereotype that the CIA held true of the FBI for a very long time. Packy McCreary jokes pretty frequently that his brother Jerry is gay, but it's mostly just that good old-fashioned Catholic homophobia. They are Irish after all. I don't think Jerry is actually gay. The neighborhood of Westdyke in Alderney State might be a reference to lesbians. Not a particularly clever or nice one, though. Further confirmation was obtained by looking at a street in that neighborhood, Beaverhead Avenue. Oh, so classy. And I'm sure there are plenty of other, mostly smaller references to queer things through GTA 4, but we're still in the original base game, and the world hasn't quite changed yet. They'd only just voted in Obama. We had to give it some time. In the meantime, we have to look at an often neglected entry in the franchise for the PSP and Nintendo DS, believe it or not. And look, I have only played Chinatown Wars all the way through once, and I've returned to its lore only briefly here and there, so there are probably things that I will miss for this one, but there's one depiction that I most definitely want to talk about that made me quite uncomfortable, even before I came out as a trans woman myself, Rudy Diavanzo. Now, cis men who cross-dress are totally a thing, not a thing that regular society is usually comfortable with, but it happens. I'm not sure though if Rudy is meant to be just a cross-dressing man or a trans woman in private. Like so many things with these references, it's impossible to say. Maybe if Rudy was a real person, they would come out as trans years later, if they hadn't been murdered. Maybe they just like to cross-dress, who knows. In the game though, Rudy's cross-dressing is meant to serve as a way of showing how weird and bad the character is. It's used as a narrative tool to emphasize that this person is two-faced, double-sided, and can't be trusted. It's a really negative and harmful stereotype for lots of people. Cross-dressers, trans people, intersex people, it's just gross. And like I said, it bothered me even back when I played it believing I was cis myself. It's possibly one of the grossest queer references in the entire series, and I really, really fucking hate it. 2 big thumbs down, boo earns. Moving on to GTA 4's first DLC, The Lost and Damned, we have one of the only references to a trans man, actually, in the whole series. I didn't remember it myself, so I'm not sure if it was on an in-game website or the radio, but the club Jousters, an upper-class gentlemen's club, denied membership to a trans man who, in response, sued them. Good. But it's finally time to move on to the one with gay in the name, Ballad of Gay Tony, and who better to start with than the titular character himself. Now, Tony Prince represented a step in a progressive direction, at least, for the franchise, explicitly trying to have a humanized, real character who is also gay. Again, remembering the contextualization of the time when this was released, 2010, for the time, it was at least more pro-queer than almost anything we'd gotten in the series up to that point. I had a comment from a patron recently when I discussed some of these topics in my worst and best character videos, and I thought their perspective was quite appropriate here. Quote, "From my perspective, I think Tony Prince is a flawed, endearing character who I was shocked wasn't the protagonist, considering how well written he is. And what a shocking contrast to Rudy. He is easily the most realistically written LGBT character in the entire franchise. He felt real, or as real as it gets, in GTA. Also, it's my opinion, and it's entirely supported by a single-framed picture on his desk in the GTA Online nightclub, but he probably had a thing for Louise, no matter how little he'll admit to that. And it very probably tore his heart to leave Liberty City for Los Santos on that alone." End quote. Well, I for one agree with Tempest. I find it especially interesting that we got a relatively good representation for gay men by 2010, when just a year prior, in 2009, with the release of Chinatown Wars, we'd gotten explicit transphobia. Again, it's fascinating to me that you can almost, in a way, plot America's acceptance of various LGBTQ identities through the franchise's releases. I personally also love Tony as a character, and his being gay is mostly incidental to the plot. Sure, he has a boyfriend and is known as Gay Tony, but there's commentary in the games themselves about the reasons for doing this and what it says about American culture as a whole. And then there's Tony's boyfriend throughout most of the game, Evan Moss. Evan is depicted as sort of a stereotypical, materialistic New York gay man. He's a bodybuilder, and he's almost exclusively obsessed with himself and the things that dating gay Tony allow him to obtain. Evan is killed near the middle of the DLC when the Lost MC ambush a deal Tony is making with the chef from the Platypus. In The Lost and Damned, you actually get to kill Evan yourself as Johnny Klebitz, but in Ballad you get to hear Tony mourn, however briefly, but still mourn, for the loss of his lover. There is also the celebrity Clay Jackson, who is sort of a amalgamation of references to various big-time rappers from the era. Clay is a character you can encounter in one of the club management missions, and it's revealed that he is a closeted gay man with a boyfriend named Jacob. You have to save Clay from being outed by the paparazzi by taking him and Jacob to a hotel in Clay's car with heavily tinted windows. While not necessarily queer, it's also worth mentioning the character who outs Clay Jackson as being gay, the Celebinator, who is a clear parody of the real-world Perez Hilton, who did much the same thing. There's an associate of John Gravelli's who is only ever mentioned, Roy Zito, who Tony Prince says he knows is gay from personal experience. Apparently, though, when confronted about this, Zito claims that Tony spiked his drink, so it's unclear if this is just him trying to hide the truth, or if Tony is a lot darker of a character than we're led to believe. The former seems more likely to me, though. There's a conversation between Luis Lopez and his friends Armando and Enrique, in which Armando and Luis pester each other about possibly being gay. Luis because he works in clubs for gay Tony, and Armando because he is rumored to have had some form of a relationship with a man during his most recent stint in prison. Armando takes this very personally, and it is therefore implied that there may be some truth to it, and since Armando is otherwise so judgmental of Luis's work, I tend to think it's true. In my opinion, 99.9% of the time, if somebody takes passionate interest in condemning a particular identity of the LGBTQ or queer people as a whole, well, they're usually repressing a lot more than they realize. Let's leave it at that. Continuing on with the trend of people, mostly just cis men at this point in time, being ashamed of people knowing that they are gay, we have Chris Hunt and Daisy Cash Coos. Well, mostly just Chris Hunt, really, who, like Clay Jackson, was rumored to be gay by the news media, and so films a video of him having a sexual encounter with Daisy, which he then posts online specifically to prove that he's straight. So we have a mix of things here: revenge porn, non-consensual filming of sexual acts, and shame of being publicly perceived as being gay. It's worth pointing out, though, I think, that for Ballad especially, none of these things are usually framed as though the closeted people are actually the bad guys. It's almost always framed as progressively as it can be for 2010 GTA anyways, as attempting to demonstrate how awful people like the Celebrinator are, or the general public, for being so judgmental. The depictions themselves aren't always positive, but they are attempting to highlight real-world problems that, again, at this point, mostly just gay cis men faced as America became more and more open to LGBTQ issues. On to GTA 5, which remains the most recent entry in the franchise, at least in terms of a full single-player campaign. A character you can encounter in the game if you find 50 letter scraps strewn about the state of San Andreas is Peter Dreyfuss. Dreyfuss is a former Vinewood director who murdered a woman, Leonora Jackson, and was frequently accused by his female coworkers of harassing them. The player can discover the truth about his murder by collecting all the letter scraps, and then, just to, I suppose, make the player see him as even weirder, they throw in some crude remarks when you encounter him that suggest he is bisexual. This reference is hard to read as anything else for me. His being bisexual is never mentioned or referenced in any other capacity, and only serves to propagate the stereotype that bisexual or pansexual people are just deviants who will screw anything. And onto some fairly explicit transphobia with the trans sex workers, who could be found outside of some clubs and even harassed with demeaning player interactions, deliberately misgendering them. These NPCs were a source of controversy in the past, and have since been removed, as far as I know, from the expanded and enhanced versions of the game on newer consoles. This upsets some people, and while these days I find all of the arguments against removing them to be pretty silly, just try to keep an open mind and hear what I have to say. This is just one of the reasons people like myself might prefer things like this be left out of the franchise in the future. Imagine if you were part of a small, marginalized group, and the only representation of people like yourself that you saw in the media that you consumed was overwhelmingly negative. This is not the same as GTA poking fun at some social issue and highlighting it in a comedic way. I spent the majority of my life believing that I was a cisgendered man and held many of the opinions that the more aggressively anti-woke people hold now, but it's nearly impossible to see what life for a marginalized group is actually like from the outside. I've only been openly living as a trans woman for about 5 months or so at the time of this video, and I can say, speaking from my own experiences, that these kinds of depictions are only harmful. Perhaps you are of the opinion that all censorship is wrong on principle, and that people like me are just being overly sensitive because Grand Theft Auto makes fun of everybody. Well, I assure you, there are ways to have positive depictions of trans people that also joke about and have fun with the reality of our lived experiences. Because yes, there is some comedy to be found in it, like anything, and comedy can be a magnificent tool for dealing with pain. All that the inclusion of some trans sex workers that you can harass does is give some transphobic cis people an opportunity to go, "Ha, trans people are weird," and then continue on with their day. It reinforces that idea subconsciously in your mind, and I imagine that this played a large part in Rockstar's decision to remove the characters from future versions, or at least in their HR department's decision to tell them they needed to do that. Allow me to be a little bit blunt here. I did a poll recently that told me, at least of my audience, nearly 20% of people identify as queer. There are lots of queer GTA fans, and we are just as much fans of the series as anybody. Rockstar would not have made the decision to remove these kinds of things if they believed that enough of their customer base actually cared about potential censorship. I believe they understood that there are a lot more people who actively play their games and buy their products who themselves are queer. The people very vocally upset about the removal of this content, who no doubt have left comments below, are a minority. They are very loud, sure, but there are way more of us than there are of them. And by us, I don't just mean queer people, I mean decent people who understand the very basic principle at play here. Accept people for who they are, do no harm, be yourself. If it isn't hurting somebody, it's none of your goddamn business, Rant concluded. Moving on to some mostly miscellaneous references to queer things, usually in a negative context across GTA 5. There's the Pump Buddy bodybuilding magazine with the tagline, "Lots of issues to work out," clearly a dig at closeted gay men. Since GTA is made by a primarily British developer, or at least ones with deeply British roots, it seems likely the Los Santos Benders is another reference to gay men. There's the video game advertised on the radio called Pride Not Prejudice, an obvious parody of Pride and Prejudice. The game is an obvious dig at the far right when it promotes the chance to save the South against liberals and land prosecutors and out the homosexuals. There's a similar dig at right-wing homophobia with the TV show Kung Fu Rainbow Laser Force, which sees a bunch of ultra-conservative kids fighting to protect family values, including explicitly homophobia. A lot of the imagery and language surrounding the in-universe equivalent to Apple, iFruit, uses gay jokes. They frequently use the term docking as an apparent reference to gay sex, and their slogan is, "It's time to dock." Another instance of them clearly wanting to make fun of Apple, and Mark Zuckerberg specifically, and their go-to insult basically being, "Ha! Gay." There's also the only mentioned briefly She-Male Bop, a group on Fame or Shame, another fairly blatant instance of transphobia. And if you go on the Vinewood Celebrity Tour, while passing Tequilala, the tour guide will mention that's where Lovefist partied with a pair of transgender twins. I guess that one isn't really explicitly transphobic though, I suppose. But I saved the big one for last. You know who it is, it's Trevor Phillips. Now, Trevor is pretty explicitly pansexual, as all should be. He is not particularly bothered by what someone has or doesn't have in their trousers, and seems to be open to both physical and even romantic love from either sex. Now, the weird thing about Trevor's depiction is, arguably he isn't a positive depiction, like at all. That's mostly because, well, everything else about Trevor is insanity cranked up to the max, and thus, his being pansexual is kind of hard not to read as a means of adding to his weirdness. It's mostly presented that way in the story too, and perhaps this is one of the reasons that Trevor is often left off of lists of queer characters in video games. But Trevor is most definitely queer, and this is where the relationship that GTA has with representation becomes the most interesting, I think. Lots of people love Trevor as a character. Some people even, and this applies to a lot more than just Trevor, find it easier to relate to characters that are otherwise very different from themselves when they have direct control over those characters' actions. So it's very possible that some people who might have otherwise been queerphobic in some way played as Trevor, and since everyone in GTA is a lunatic, judged him as not particularly different from the crazies around him, and thus accepted some of his weirdness as actually just normal. But again, this is where it's weird because Trevor isn't normal. He isn't meant to be, which again almost certainly is the reason he was even made pan in the first place. Trevor will screw anything that moves, and that is how his pansexuality is portrayed. Ultimately, I think this is a fairly negative and harmful stereotype of both pan and bisexual people, and one that I've brought up before. But even with all of that being said, I still love Trevor as a character, and ultimately, I take away something positive from his depiction, if at least the precedent that he sets for the series. It's like Rennie. Rennie isn't a healthy or positive portrayal of trans people, but they are also framed as sympathetic, and I just love them. Trevor is definitely characterized as being completely insane and being the most deviant and least reliable of the protagonists, but he is still very much human, and the game does treat him as such. A crazy human, certainly, but still one that even the game encourages you to occasionally have sympathy for, especially since you control him. Making a video like this was honestly one of the most terrifying things I've ever done. I am incredibly lucky in a lot of ways. The fact that I've felt comfortable enough to transition as I am is, in and of itself, an incredible privilege, and I live in one of the most accepting countries regarding LGBTQ issues in the world, Canada. Now, of the normal population, most estimates say between about 2 and 6% of people identify as queer. Of my audience, those who answer YouTube polls anyway, about 20% identified, as I mentioned earlier, which I would love to believe is representative of the GTA fandom as a whole, but I'm not too sure. Especially given that estimates usually only put the total percentage of queer gamers at around 10%. Of the other 90%, I'd guess that it's a very vocal minority of people that are truly hateful. Optimistically, I'd say maybe 5% of that 90, but I really don't know. Point is, the amount of disgusting comments I have no doubt opened myself up to by releasing this video is, well, let's just say it's going to be a lot. This has been my sympathy pitch. Please give me all your money. Patreon.com/thecriminalhistorian. Seriously though, if you enjoyed this video, please at least consider supporting me on Patreon. You'll get access to all of the original music that I've made for the channel, which is over 100 tracks at this point, early access to videos, as well as uncensored patron-only versions of videos sometimes, and your name in the credits of every video produced while you're pledged. It helps a lot. And don't forget to do all the YouTube things like subscribe, bell notifications, etc., etc. I am the Criminal Historian. Thank you so much for watching.